Painting white with watercolor is one of the most challenging things you can learn about this medium because we don't have the luxury of having white paint or the ability to erase and paint over something dark with a lighter pigment. But it's also very rewarding because once you know the key techniques and tricks, you can get excited about painting truly luminous compositions with white flowers or snowy mountains. I personally love white horses and swans. So in this tutorial, which has been requested by so many of you, we will paint this white peony and we will use it to go over the main techniques for painting white that will help you with any of your future paintings featuring white subjects. Our main steps will be as follows: the background layer where we block off our white areas and the follow-up shadow layer. Let's start with this first layer because it's the key part, and if we get this one right, I promise the second layer will be super easy and much more intuitive. Now let's get started. So in order to paint a white subject with watercolor, we need to actually paint around the white areas. And what I mean by that is we need to identify areas of our flower, in this case, that look truly white, that receive the most light, and leave them blank. Very carefully paint around them. If you can't quite distinguish them right away, I have two ways of showing you. So number one, and this is something that I do as I paint sometimes from reference photos, you can zoom in and clearly see that within each petal, there are some areas that are almost 100% white if I were to use a color picker, and other areas of the same white petal that have a slight hint of color on them. And I'm not talking about obvious shadows, which we will paint in the second layer. I'm talking about the main areas of the petal that are either very thin and let some color from the background come through, or have some reflections from surrounding objects. There are many different reasons for why a white object will have some color. For the most part, if it's very translucent, it will be letting some color through from behind. And the second reason is, of course, reflections from surrounding objects, because a white petal like this will be reflecting all sorts of things around it, including green leaves, other flowers, and so on. The second tool I'm going to give you is a separate picture just like this, where you can see the areas where I put down the color and the areas that remained pure white. So our goal here is to block off the white areas, meaning we're going to put down very light pigment on every part of the flower that is not a true white highlight. I'm starting with Quinacridone Red at the base of the petal, blending with clear water towards the edge. You may switch to a cooler pink like I did here, using a little bit of magenta. If you see a variation in temperature, there are some areas of those petals that have more vivid pink that are in the shadow, and so that's why I'm switching to magenta there, but it's not necessary. If you're just practicing, you don't have to complicate your painting by adding different shades of the same color. And you can see as I'm moving up, I'm going to switch to much lighter purple, and I'm using Dioxazine Purple from QOR. And right now I am applying Phthalo Blue Green shade, which is a cool blue. Notice how light my application is. At this point, we're just focusing on the thinnest part of the petal, the very edge, and all I need is just a hint of color to differentiate that area from the pink base and also from the true white highlights. Switching to the next petal, here I'm going to start from the edge and carefully paint around those tiny white highlights that I have marked up in my mind, not with a pencil, that I want to leave completely white. Don't worry about those deep, large shadows that are being cast by petals. We will paint them in the next layer. Right now, what's important is just blocking off the true white areas with a very light wash. So don't rush. Even if you see a deep shadow, disregard it for now and keep your values very light. So in step 1, we're working towards something like this. And my tip number 2 for painting white is to avoid gray pigments and use colors instead. In fact, you want to add subtle transitions in color temperature on the areas of the flower that are not pure white. As you can see, based on the natural coloring of this flower, we will have the following pigments that we will need to apply. So starting with pinks at the base of each petal, a bit more saturated than the rest, transitioning to purple in the middle of each petal, and all the way to cooler blues on the edges. And the reason for that is we obviously have some red, natural red on the petals in the center, but the white itself, the rest of the petal, will have subtle shades of other colors because the petal gets thinner and thinner towards the edge. It's picking out some sunlight, some reflections from surrounding petals, and as it gets thinner, it becomes more translucent, so we're able to see some colors from behind some of these petals. Tip number 3, notice here, this is one of the key things for any flower subject, but particularly a peony. I'm keeping my brush strokes in the direction of the petals so that if I do create some white islands without any color, they're pointing towards the center of the petal, so it's a very natural highlight there. And I'm adding a little bit of Quinacridone Red as I move to the center, and maybe even some Dioxazine Purple just to warm it up. The red base of the petal is not visible, but there's still a little bit of a hint of that red or pink that spreads towards the edge of the petal. Very slowly, very light, always directing your brush towards the center so that if you're leaving any white strips of dry paper, they're following the natural lines of the petal so that our highlights look realistic. Let's switch to the petals in the background. I'm gonna start with my purple and carefully paint around the tiny fold, follow with magenta. More blue as I move closer to the edge. Again, it's the same logic from warmer pinks at the base of the petal to cooler blues as we move out. Lots of highlights there, so a lot of white space that I don't touch with my brush. And I'm gonna carry it closer to the stamens with a little bit of yellow because the stamens will also give some reflection, so you could introduce some yellow around it and then follow afterwards with more pink. And now I'm gonna come back to the stamens, and over that layer of light yellow, put down the native red, a lot more saturated. No details at this point. We're gonna come back and add the thin lines, make it a bit more defined in the second layer. You can see the shape of the flower is emerging slowly. Just by painting around the highlights, we're getting a 3D effect, just the beginnings of it. In the next layer is where we're going to add deep shadows, and it's really going to look realistic, but this layer, this step is essential because everything we do in the next layer will build upon what we're doing right now. In this second layer, our definition layer, we have 2 big jobs, and as an optional step towards the end, I will show you how I've added the background. So step number 1, we need to add some red details at the base of our petals with a much more saturated red, and it will require some precise brush work for those thin red petal veins, so make sure you get your finest, thinnest brush out for this part. The second big job we have, and this is extremely important for any white flower, it's those large shadows. If you recall my earlier tutorial on painting a white rose, I mentioned that one of the most helpful things you can do when painting white flower or any white subject is to pick the right reference photo with strong shadows. You really want to have good, strong sunlight and crisp shadows like we do here, because it's the shadows that will help us create a sense of volume. Shadows help with any subject, but especially white or light subjects where we don't have a lot of color to play with, and for the most part we're relying on the difference in values to create volume and a sense of realistic shape on paper. So compare our reference photo to this one, also a white peony taken with diffused light. You can see how it would be much more challenging to recreate this on paper with all those soft shadows and subtle white transitions. Luckily we have good solid shadows on our peony here, so let's get started. Our goal is to paint the pink parts at the base of each petal with more saturated color, adding more definition and really focusing on those accents, the elongated lines that go along the petal. And so all I'm gonna do is use my original Quinacridone Red. You may have used something like Quinacridone Rose or Permanent Rose, any transparent red that you've used in the first layer. Go a few shades darker, so more saturated, less water. And looking at your reference photo, simply paint wet on dry, so with wet paint on dry paper, the shapes that you see in the reference photo. There's going to be, for the most part, a little block of color at the base and then thin lines that extend from it. And so you can see here I just did a couple of lines going up the petal. You don't need to, again, be too precise in terms of the number of lines. It depends on the size of your painting and how realistic you want to go, but I would try to come up with a number depending on how thin your brush is, because you really want them to start off thick and then almost disappear into the petals. Let's do the same thing on this petal. You can see I sort of started at the base with the tip of my brush, creating a rather thin strip of color, and then from that strip I'm going to drag a few lines out with the tip of my brush. And you may want to switch to a thinner brush at this point. I'm using size 3, but these series 7 brushes are very fine. They give you good coverage but also allow you to do thin lines. If your brush is too thick, switch to something like size 1 or even 0 for this part of the work. My main tip here is to put your thin strokes, the veins that are extending from the base of each petal, always put them in the direction of the petal. So try to direct your brush towards the edge of the petal from the center of the flower. And don't make them too long. They need to end roughly where your pink underpainting ends. You don't want to extend them all the way to even the center of the petal. Keep them short, saturated, so they stand out, and oriented towards the edge of the petal. Let's add more definition to the center of the flower, and here I'm adding a little bit of magenta to my Quinacridone Red just to match the color that's underneath, make it a bit cooler, but stick to one red if you're using limited palette, and be very careful as you're painting around the yellow stamens. You really want to maintain an outline there that you originally drew, so don't make it like a smooth blob of yellow. Make sure there is some bumps and texture visible. And now tip number 4. The more contrast we add in the center, the more successful this flower is going to be, because the eye will naturally be drawn towards the middle. So more contrast and more opportunity to play with light and dark values. This petal on the lower tier, again, I'm going to start with Quinacridone Red and then blend it with a very light wash of purple to add the shadow. After all, the lower tier petals are getting some shadow from the petals up on top, so another opportunity to add more definition and value contrast. I'm going to switch to the right now and do something very similar. Start with Quinacridone Red and blend it out, maybe adding some thin veins. Now it's time to work on larger shadows. And so I'm going to start with this petal facing us, follow the outline that I've created with my pencil, and I'm going to be adding other colors into my shadow, starting with aqua green, warmer purple and cooler aqua green, just to add a little bit of visual interest and follow the color logic that I've established in the first layer, where the base of my petals is always a little bit warmer and more pink, and it gets more blue and green as I move to the edge. By the way, if you're enjoying this tutorial and you feel like you're getting some value, please consider clicking the like button, as it would really help me reach more artists on YouTube, more people who may enjoy this type of instructional video. And of course, consider subscribing if you would like to see more of my tutorials. Quick tip here, the value of these larger shadows should be somewhere in between the value of your dark red spots in the middle of the flower and the light off-white color we used for the petals in the first layer. So not as dark as your red spots, but not as light as the color we put down on the petals, somewhere in between. I'm happy for now with the shadows at the bottom, and I'm going to work on the ones in the middle of the flower. And here, because of the yellow stamens that are giving away reflections, warm yellow reflections, I'm gonna use my Perylene Violet, which is kind of a brownish violet, instead of my purple to start. There are a lot of different folds and shadows in that area. I'm simplifying, of course, just focusing on the larger ones, even merging some of the smaller shapes. You can see again I'm glazing with a very light color, so I'm not going dark at all. And when I have my Perylene Violet on top of my Dioxazine Purple off-white color, it looks even darker, but it's not even close to how dark my red spots are at the base of each petal. Here on the right, I'm going to start with my blue, which is echoing the blue on the parrot. It's Phthalo blue red shade, and I'm going to transition into Quinacridone Violet, follow with a more colorful version. I think the key is just to get comfortable with the layering process, and as you get more and more comfortable, you will start seeing other colors and intuitively extending your palette to include subtle variations. So don't get discouraged if this feels a bit too overwhelming. Simply try following the shadow shapes. This will be enough to create a nice sense of volume on your white petals. Most of our larger shadows are done. What I'm doing right now is just spending a few minutes to go around the flower, looking for opportunities to add a little bit more value, double down on some shadows, especially on the edges that I want to stand out against the white petals, and adding a little bit of color here and there on those smaller parts. In many cases, you'll see like the tiny fold that requires a little bit more value, or perhaps a particularly deep shadow. The intersections of different petals, for the most part, will need some contrast in order to define the shapes. So that's what I'm doing right now. And this is really a process of asking yourself questions like, is this dark enough? Do I want this area to stand out? The more contrast you add, the more something will come forward on your page. All I'm doing is just adding slight variations of value, very gentle, careful glazes on the areas where I want to add more definition. Your final painting may look very similar to this. Don't worry if some of the shadows you're not able to capture. Feel free to simplify, group some of the highlights into larger highlights. The key is to have this careful separation between the true white and the areas of color that we will be applying throughout white petals. The last and one of the most helpful techniques for painting white subjects with watercolor is to add a background. And although it's not essential, it is extremely useful technique to have some color in the background, as it will instantly bring out the white in the petals. Note that your background doesn't have to be a solid block of color. You can use a variety of techniques. On that white rose, I covered the entire area with some muted greens and purples, simply suggesting some leaf shapes. And I will leave the link to that tutorial in the video description. But here, for this peony, I'm going to do something different, but just as effective in terms of bringing the highlights out on our flower. I will use several other reference photos and add some red peonies and green leaves behind the flower. It will be very loose here, not really following any particular step-by-step technique, simply adding some color behind the white peony, building value as I go without adding too much definition, because I want the white peony to remain the center of the composition, or at least this part of the composition if you're painting something larger like I'm doing here with this parrot. The main thing, this is the only piece of advice I would give you here, is recycling the colors, meaning I will rely on the same Quinacridone Red that I used on the white peony to create those other red peonies around. I will reuse my Dioxazine Purple and my Quinacridone Magenta, maybe even Perylene Violet, to add some definition to the greenery and red petals behind the white peony. This way I will be avoiding a clash, making the overall composition seamless. Typically, red is a very strong accent color, and we use it to highlight and focus certain areas of the painting. But here, red will actually serve us as a framing device, because it will echo the red in the center of the white peony. And notice that even on the green leaves, I will be adding a little bit of my Quinacridone Red to some of the tips, blending it with the green, so that red again serves as a background color, framing that bright white in the middle. If you're interested in other background techniques, I have a comprehensive tutorial on different types of watercolor background, and again I'm going to link the video in the description below. So depending on your level of comfort and how far you want to take this painting, you can apply different styles, from a very basic wet on wet wash with subtle variations in color and not much detail, to a multi-layer background with more defined flowers and leaves. So I'll leave it up to you to decide how you want to go about it. The most important thing is enjoy the process and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for watching and painting with me.